Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2022. This is, as the title indicates, an event designed to celebrate Star Trek fiction. It's 2 months long, so August and September. And in August, we're doing The Wrath of Book Trek, where we are looking at older Star Trek. So the bright white line down the middle of the Star Trek continuity. On one side, you have everything under the shadow of Gene Roddenberry, which is the original series, the animated series, all the movies, the Next Generation, its movies, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Star Trek Enterprise. And then on the other side of that divide, you have the J.J. Abrams Kelvin universe, the Kelvin timeline for his movies, and New Trek, which is not in the Kelvin universe. It is allegedly in the Roddenberry universe, but it doesn't care about that universe, so it feels like a separate thing. It feels like an alternate universe, an alternate reality. And there's a whole bunch of properties in New Trek. It's not just one or two anymore. There's a whole bunch. Star Trek Discovery. I wonder if I can name them all. Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Lower Depths, Star Trek Prodigy, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds. So that's 5 shows. That's the same number as on the other side. They aren't, a lot of them, very old, but there's a lot of stuff in New Trek, and we'll be dealing with that next month. A lot of that is new ground to me, so expect a lot of ranting. But Book Trek is not the only BookTube event that I am involved in for the month of March. The other one is Garb August. Book Trek was created by Vin at Revenant Reads, our invisible captain. But Garb August was created by Ollie at Criminale. Now, they both have facial hair, but they're two completely different events. Garb August is meant to celebrate garbage. It's meant to celebrate trash literature all month long, and it's a blast. But one of you left a comment on a recent Star Trek video of mine, a recent Book Trek video of mine, that dared me to cross the streams. It dared me to mix matter and antimatter, even further than I did in a recent episode of Garb August, where I decided, one of the contentions that I make in Garb August is that you're not losing any points among friends. You're not hurting your standing among people who are actual adults if you admit that there's some trash that you love. There's nothing wrong with that. The only thing that becomes wrong with that is if the fact that you love it leads you to say, especially to me, that it's not trash. Or that nothing is trash. That who can tell what's trash and what's not. I would appreciate it if you would not say things like that to me. They are utter sheepdip. Of course, you can tell what's trash and what's not trash. The whole point, the only reason that anybody would ever be driven to say otherwise is because they feel a little shame in liking trash. There's nothing wrong with that. Anyone who tries to make you ashamed of what you like or don't like in reading is a snob and should be dismissed. Just don't pay any attention. But I've been making the point in Garb August that if you have the strength of your convictions, you can turn an assessing eye even on the trash you love. Admit that it's trash, pick apart its faults as trash, and still love it. And for Garb August, I did a video on a prime example of that in my own life, which is The Son of Tarzan by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which I think in any sober assessment comes out as trash, and yet I love it. I don't know how many times I've read it. And a commenter on a Star Trek video for Book Trek almost dared me, in a good-natured way, almost dared me to go even further than that. Is there trash you love that's Star Trek trash? Now, my love of garbage goes back almost to the beginning of my love of reading. And Edgar Rice Burroughs is right there at the beginning, but so is Star Trek. And in a far more personal way, because when the original Star Trek ended, I was desolate. And so were thousands of other people who had loved it, even in its embattled 3rd season. And suddenly it was gone. And the only thing that was left of it was fan fiction. And there were a ton of fanzines. And in the block print at the bottom of page 6 or whatever would be the post office box where you could send your $2.50 to get a copy of the next issue of that fanzine if you liked it. Some got to be fairly glitzy, fairly high profile, like T-Negative and a few others. But there were lots and lots of them. This was the days before the internet, before fanfiction.net or anything like that. When you would make these things on a dot matrix printer and you would try to correct errors, you would lay them out yourself, typeface them yourself, and then mail them off to people. And if you got a big enough list of people who were interested, you would start to ask if maybe they could send an SASE, which is gibberish in the 21st century. That was a self-addressed stamped envelope. So that you would get a letter with the request for an issue of the fanzine, and you would also get an envelope with postage already paid. So all you had to do was mail it. So you didn't assume the mailing cost. SASEs used to be the currency of my existence. I read a lot of Star Trek fanzines, a lot of them. And I also read the Trek magazine that was designed to sort of talk about Trek for those lean and desolate years when there was nothing. There were James Blish adaptations. James Blish also did a novel called Spock Must Die, but there was almost nothing else. And those things weren't anything to write home about. They didn't often capture the essence. I don't think that James Blish had ever watched an episode of Star Trek before he started writing Star Trek adaptations. Certainly I don't think that he was ever much of a fan of the show, if fan is in italics. And I ate that stuff up. I just ate it up. But I also read it critically. I couldn't help but do that. And I was able to see when I did that a lot of elements that it had in common. Stories written by people in Muncie, Indiana, Anchorage, Alaska, that still shared common things, common traits among them. I couldn't help but start to toad up a lot of those common traits. One was that 95% of this fan fiction was written by women. That was unavoidable to notice. But two was that a lot of darker elements came out. Fan fiction had a tendency not only to push the Enterprise and its crew to the breaking point and beyond. Warp nacelles being sheared off in combat. Missiles blasting through the main hull of the Enterprise, something we would have to wait 30 years to see in the movies. Not only that, but also the crew individually pushed to the breaking point, especially Spock and Kirk, who were very often liberally physically tortured in a lot of this fanzine Star Trek fiction. Liberally. There was quite a bit of this fiction where they were erotic partners. But there was also quite a bit where they were tortured, either individually or separately, and sometimes those two elements mixed. Sometimes there was more often, not more often than not, but quite often, so often that you couldn't avoid noticing it. There was a straight-up sadomasochistic element in Star Trek fiction. Now, a lot of it didn't have that. There were tons and tons of stories. People wrote backstories, including one enormous, epic backstory telling the story of the civilization of Vulcan from the very beginning. Another one was a long biography of Spock's father, Sarek. Another was a gigantic epic about the founding and growth of the Gorn Empire told in verse. This was a character, one of which who had appeared in one episode, and about whom we know nothing. And on and on and on. Tons and tons of stuff like that. Poetry, limericks, joke stories, long serialized stuff that just went on forever and ever for years. And gradually, out of that primordial soup, other novels started to take shape. Not just James Blish's Spock Must Die, not just Spock Messiah, but other novels started to take shape. Partly, this was because Paramount, the studio that owned Star Trek, started to realize very dimly, very hesitantly at first, that these things sold. That there was a market out there. They had no way of taking that seriously. They didn't take it seriously at first, but they gradually started to realize that books would sell. I was not alone, nor were lots and lots of other people in cornfields of Iowa, in the wheat fields of Kansas, anywhere, in being instantly willing to spend your very limited 1970s spending cash on anything Star Trek that came out. There used to be a science fiction magazine called Starlog. If it had a majority of Star Trek content in an issue, that issue would sell out everywhere. Back issues would sell out. They'd be collectible at conventions. And people notice that. Even people who don't know what Star Trek is or care at all about it notice that. So gradually, novels started to form, including quite a few that happened before Star Trek the Motion Picture. Once Star Trek the Motion Picture hit the theaters and made back its production cost, and made the studio and all the producers realize that this could be an ongoing franchise. The minute you say the word ongoing franchise, hands jut up out of Hollywood cemeteries because those are property lawyers. And suddenly, nothing connected with ongoing franchise can be left to the Wild West. Nothing. Suddenly, there are lawyers involved in everything, including the novels. So there was a brief period, a very brief period, where the novels were sort of freeform. And it's probably unavoidable that during that freeform period, the novels that showed up would largely echo some of the predilections of fan fiction, of straight-up fan fiction, especially if they were written by people who had written straight-up fan fiction. Which brings us, by a circuitous route, to my Book Trek book for today, because I'm taking that commentator up on his challenge, which is to turn an eye to a piece of Star Trek fiction that he outright called garbage, and that I have loved from the minute it appeared 45 years ago, and it was written by two of the original Star Trek's die-hard fans, two of the original Star Trek's most fervent true believers. And it's a book I've mentioned many times on this channel before. It's The Price of the Phoenix by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth, published in 1977. So, the Wild West. James Blish's books, his adaptations of Star Trek Adventures were still coming out when this showed up, but there was almost nothing else. And certainly nothing like this. This was nothing like anything that had appeared in Star Trek fiction before. And I never need much prompting to reread this book. I don't know how many times I have read it, but I read it again with that challenge. It wasn't really, the commentator didn't really, the article didn't really mean it as a challenge, but I took it as one, and I read it with that in mind, to see if there's any way that I can weasel out of calling this garbage, because I don't want to call it garbage. I freely admit that. This is the story of a villain named Omni, O-M-N-E, not to be confused with O-M-N-I, the old science fiction magazine, the late lamented Omni magazine. Omni has a planet that is the center of a loose-knit alliance of non-aligned worlds. He distrusts wall-to-wall empires, Klingons, the Romulans, the Federation. He doesn't like them. He thinks they're ultimately the enemies of freedom, even the freedom to be bad. And that would be bad enough. That and the fact that he's developed a planet shielding technology that is proof against transporters and proof against weapons. He could hold out on his bolt hole planet against the full-armed might of the Enterprise. And he issues an invitation to Kirk and Spock, and also to the female Romulan commander from the Enterprise incident, to come and visit him on his planet. There's a group of delegates, there's a talk, there's a gathering where he wants to discuss some things, but he has a separate goal in mind for Kirk and Spock and the Romulan commander, because in addition to those shields, he has developed another piece of technology, an astounding piece of technology, a galaxy-changing piece of technology. By melding Star Trek's already existing technology, the replicators, the transporter, along with a few key innovations of his own, he has come up with a device, the Phoenix device, that can make a perfect copy of another human being. Not an android, not a duplicate with flaws, but a perfect duplicate of another person. He needs, for the Phoenix process to work, the extremis of death. That's the thing. Whatever happens at that moment, if a person is facing their own death, then he can get an imprint of them and make a duplicate. He can't just do it from a standing start, so to speak. And so, when he invites Kirk and Spock to his little bolt hole planet, he arranges an accident where a woman and a baby run into a burning house. He knows perfectly well, he's read his men, he knows Jim Kirk will run in and try to save her. And to all appearances, that is what happens, and the roof caves in. And Spock watches as his captain is buried under burning rubble. And later, when they can, he and Dr. McCoy pull Jim Kirk's dead body out of the rubble and beam it back to the Enterprise. And Omni then confronts them with a living Jim Kirk. who he says he has put through his process, the Phoenix process. But Omni stresses over and over again, this is an exact duplicate of your Jim Kirk, but it's also my property. It's made life. So it doesn't have any rights of its own, doesn't have an identity of its own, doesn't by any means have to go back to you. It has now become the highest bidding chip in the most deadly game of poker in the galaxy. I have demonstrated that this process works, and by using it on the captain of the flagship of the Federation, I have demonstrated the kind of havoc it can wreak. And Omni seems mostly concerned with wreaking havoc, and also a few personal elements when it comes to Jim Kirk's manhood. Because this book has a liberal amount of the elements that I was describing. It has a liberal amount of sadomasochism that is almost totally extraneous to the real plot of the book. Omni doesn't just want to own Jim Kirk. He wants to break him. He wants to make him cry like a baby for his own sake through physical domination. Omni is a giant. He's well over 7 feet tall, and he has Vulcan-level strength. So Jim Kirk in physical combat against him doesn't have a single chance. You might say, well, but didn't Jim Kirk beat Khan? Didn't he beat the Gorn? Hasn't he fought Spock? Wouldn't he have a chance? But in this book, no. Sonder Marshak and Myrna Culbreath had the idea that Vulcans were incredibly super strong, and since Romulans are an offshoot of Vulcans, they are super strong as well. Romulans are even harder to believe than Vulcans in the case of the original series, because in the Enterprise incident, Kirk is in the engineering room of a Romulan warship when he is interrupted by a Romulan, a male Romulan his size, who is perfectly aware that he must be some sort of terrorist, and who's standing there at the ready, 6 feet away from Kirk. And Kirk drop kicks him once in the chin, fairly lightly, and that knocks him unconscious. So we don't have any direct evidence of super strong Romulans, but they're in this book. That's the one of the points here. This book very often comes down to physical confrontation. And the humans lose in those confrontations, and Omni knows that. Because he didn't just make a duplicate of Jim Kirk, a character who in this book is referred to as James. He also used a conventional transporter to save the original Kirk, who, as he says, damningly, never lost consciousness. So there are two now. As you can tell from the cover, this is there are going to be a few spoilers, but then again, this is a 45-year-old Star Trek novel that's not in print and is never going to be in print again. Anyone at Paramount who has read even 30 pages into this book will never let it come to print again. The fact that Omni is playing these kinds of games with his best friend drives Mr. Spock to the edge of complete rage, savage rage, pre-Surak, pre-logic Vulcan rage. And so, hovering over the book for 100 pages, while Omni is playing all sorts of intricate games and being sarcastic and very intelligent, very manipulative towards Kirk and Spock and James and the Romulan commander, hovering over all of that, you know what's coming. You know that at some point in this book, Spock and Omni are going to square off for a physical fight. Omni has a fetish for the Old West. He's armed at his waist with 6 shooters with actual revolvers, and he has phaser-type equipment, and so do Kirk and Spock. But you know it's going to come down to that. Kirk might fight Omni and lose and be broken, or maybe not broken, and cry, or maybe not cry. And we're told often that the Romulan commander wouldn't have a chance against Omni. That's a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow, but probably true. I think the best trained, the actress who played the Romulan commander in the Enterprise incident was 5'2". I think the best trained 5'5" female Mossad agent would have very little or no chance against an equally trained operative the size of Dwayne Johnson, the size of The Rock. There's not much you can do in a situation like that. I know that modern 21st century pop culture will have you believe otherwise, but there's not much you can do against a difference like that. So it was a bitter pill to swallow. She is beautifully characterized in this book. I would argue that it's a masterpiece of characterization, considering that we only have one episode to go on. Although she features very prominently in a lot of that unofficial fan fiction, which will never be collected now. God knows where all of that stuff is. What I wouldn't give for a 1,000-page omnibus that contained a lot of that stuff. It's all gone now. It's moldering in people's drawers as a memory of when we had to keep Star Trek alive ourselves before the studio did it. It's a shame that all that is gone. I have some of it, but I don't have anywhere near a fraction of what I read. And what I read was only a fraction of what was out there. The Romulan commander is really well done in here, but there is no 21st century Mary Sueism in here. She knows that in a fight against Omni, she wouldn't have much of a chance. She gets in her licks when she can. But really, the fight that is foreshadowed, that is hovering over this whole book, is Spock versus Omni. Omni is twice Spock's size. But Spock is enraged to an extent that Omni can't match. And eventually that fight does happen. And there is a climax to the book. I don't want to spoil, although I'm not sure how much I can spoil a book, an out-of-print science fiction novel that's 45 years old. But there's a climax to the book that involves a key question, right? Omni has invented this technology and he's used it to duplicate Jim Kirk. But there's a far cry from that to trusting that it will save his life, letting himself die. That's a quite different thing. Omni has never made that leap until he does. So there's a climax, and then there's another climax in this book, and also a cliffhanger. And you know that there's a cliffhanger because there's a sequel to this book called The Fate of the Phoenix that's twice as long. Fans at the time bombarded Sandra Mashuk and Myrna Culbreth in their post office box with requests for a sequel to this book. It wasn't the Goodreads aggregate or anything like that. There was no internet. They bombarded them directly with requests for a sequel to this book, and so they got one. And the sequel is really good, but as a sequel to The Price of the Phoenix, is it really good? Is this really garbage? I want to read you something. Just one passage here. Because I want to make a few arguments. I want to make a few arguments for or against this being trash. Obviously, I am reluctant to just resign this to being trash. Obviously, I am. But I want to read you a little discussion that Omni has with Jim Kirk. Where Kirk is talking to Omni about how he doesn't get to be judge and jury, and he's a murderer. So the value of his process notwithstanding, he has to answer for his crimes. Kirk brushed it aside with a hand. Self-defense, no cop-outs, Omni. You have, and you have done worse. You've caused all the grief of murder. I don't know how to name the other grief, but the woman died. In the fire, in other words, where Jim was trying to run in to save her. Suicide, Omni said. It was her right and her custom. I did not arrange that, I merely used it. I have created a haven here for custom and free choice, even the wrong choice. The first principle of freedom is the right to go to hell in your own handbasket. Kirk shook his head. Provided it is your own hell and your own handbasket, and you don't take passengers who have no choice, such as the baby. Omni spread his hands. It's not possible to have it both ways, Captain. Custom is custom, or it is not. Non-interference is non-interference, or it is not. Anything else is moral judgment on the basis of feeling and the self-indulgence of imposing your gut reaction on the universe. Kirk straightened gravely and stood quiet. No, he said solemnly. It can be, which is the reason for having a prime directive, but there is a logic to moral judgment, and there are judgments which have to be made. That is the reason for having men who will make them on the tough ones. Right or wrong, but make them and stand responsible. There is no sanctity to custom. The many can be wrong as the one, and antiquity as wrong as tomorrow. The sanctity is in life, and in the freedom needed to preserve and enjoy it. Custom is the frozen form of men's choices, not to be shattered lightly, but it does not abolish the need to choose. Moments like that crop up all through this book, and I want to argue very weakly that doesn't happen in trash. That writing like that doesn't happen in something that is complete trash. Now, this is... The characters talk in partial sentences. The narration is breathless. There's no other word for it. But theoretical discussions like that about the nature of independence or dependence or the prime directive or the worth of wall-to-wall empires is good. The phrasing in there, freedom even to go to hell in your own handbasket, provided it's your own hell and your own handbasket, and you don't take others with you, that is good stuff. I'm not sure that it isn't trash, but it's not bad trash. So the most I'm willing to say, the compromise that I want to reach here, I know this is just awful. The compromise that I want to reach here, I've racked my brains thinking, well, if I've made, I believe now in a couple of videos, Michael K. Vaughan has wailed like a wombat in agony because I called the Son of Tarzan trash. It caused him physical kidney damage. And I thought, if I am responsible for making him wail like that, then I ought to take my lumps and call this trash, even though I love it. And I agonized over that and came to an escape clause. I have an escape clause. This might be trash when it comes to Star Trek fiction or science fiction. I say might be because I bet you would find this a lot more enjoyable than most Star Trek fiction you have read. It is never safe. It is never boring. It never has any of those long, page-long stretches that you sense in later Star Trek novels were dictated by a lawyer over the shoulder of the workaday author. The lawyers weren't involved in this. They didn't care about Star Trek fiction at this point. You get different Star Trek fiction when that is true. And this is a very good example of that. This never lets up. Never. And it does all sorts of things that Star Trek fiction isn't allowed to do anymore. Spock and Omni do fight. And when Spock has Omni at an advantage, he puts his fingers to Omni's forehead and says he intends to rip out the memory of everything that Omni has done, how his process works, and everything that he's done to Kirk and James and Spock and the Romulan commander. And Omni is helpless and says to him, that's worse than what I did to you. And Spock doesn't care. That moment, a moment like that, will never happen in a Star Trek novel now. And it didn't happen for 40 years after this book. I argue that there's a benefit in that. There is a reading enjoyment in that. And it's not, you heard, it's not dumb. Writing like that is not dumb. It might be set in a kind of a trashy setting, but it's not dumb writing. It might be breathless, it might be headlong, it might be a little adolescent at times, and it certainly often resembles a kind of writing, that fanzine writing, that dot matrix writing, that is long gone, and that only a handful of people alive today remember. But I don't want to admit that this is just trash. So I came up with a way out. I came up with an escape clause. And that is that this is really good for fan fiction, for Star Trek fan fiction. This and its sequel are the apotheosis, the living pinnacle of the old Star Trek fanzine fiction before the studios noticed it, before the fans had to toe the line, when the fans could do whatever they want. There are bad examples of that kind of Star Trek fiction. There's a novel by Kathleen Sky called Vulcan. It is a very bad example of that kind of fiction. I argue that this is an excellent example of that kind of fiction, and that is the way that I am weaseling out of calling The Price of the Phoenix trash. So that's my Star Trek book for today. I finally did a whole video on The Price of the Phoenix. I love this book. I enjoyed rereading it every bit as much now as I did 45 years ago, and as I have countless times in between then and now. And I'd be willing to take a chance and say that you might love this too. It will, if you started reading Star Trek fiction because you fell in love with The Next Generation, this will read like no Star Trek fiction you've ever read, for good or bad, or good and bad. But the Jesuitical hair-splitting excuse that I'm giving is that this isn't trash because it's the best Star Trek zine fiction ever written. And now I'm going to beat a hasty retreat to safer ground. Thank you, too.